Welcome back to the Anti-Cancer Lab. If you're new here, pull up a chair, you're in good company. This is where I read the cancer metabolism studies most people never see, and I tell you plainly what they actually mean for your plate. No fear, no hype, no miracle claims, just the research translated. So go ahead and grab a coffee, settle in, and let's look at this together. Today's one is simpler than the internet makes it, but there's a twist in the middle that most people get exactly backwards, and by the end you're going to know how to win an argument in the bread aisle with your eyes closed. Quick note before we go anywhere, and I say a version of this at the top of every video because it genuinely matters. I'm Dr. Becker. I'm a researcher, not your doctor. I have never had cancer, and I have never treated a single patient. Everything I bring you here is me sitting down with published studies and translating them into plain English for general education. None of it is medical advice, and none of it replaces your oncologist, your treatment team, or the people actually caring for you right now. If something I say today is useful, bring it to them. Carry it to your next appointment and let them weigh in. Always alongside your care team, never instead of them. All right, now we can get into this. Let me tell you where this one started for me, because I think it'll set up the whole video better than any statistic could. I was standing in the bread aisle at my supermarket a while back, holding 2 loaves, one in each hand, and I was genuinely stuck. Here's the thing, they looked almost identical. Same size, same soft golden crust, same farmhouse picture on the bag, and both of them said the word wheat right there on the front in friendly green lettering. If you handed them to me blindfolded, I could not have told you which was which. But here's what I knew, from the studies I'd been reading at the time. Nutritionally, one of those loaves behaves in your body in a way the research keeps linking, gently and consistently, to a less favorable internal environment for long-term health. And the other one behaves in almost the opposite direction. 2 loaves, 12 inches apart on the same shelf, and a real biological difference hiding between them that the packaging was actively working to obscure. I'll be honest with you. For years before I started reading this literature seriously, I thought bread was just bread. I had this simple mental map. Brown is healthy, white is junk, move on. That is lazy. And it turns out it is also wrong in some specific ways that matter. So I want to walk you through this carefully, because once you learn to read a bread bag properly, you will never stand in that aisle confused again. And you will stop getting played by some very clever marketing. Let me start with an opinion before I show you a single study, because that's how I like to do this. If I had to name the one everyday food where a small, boring, almost effortless swap delivers the most long-term benefit for the least disruption to your life, bread would be near the top of that list. Not because bread is some great villain. It isn't, but because most of us eat it every single day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, week after week, year after year, for decades. And when something shows up in your body that often, the differences that look small on paper don't stay small over time. They compound. Quietly, over 20 years, those differences add up into a pattern, and it's the pattern that matters in cancer biology. So yes, I take bread seriously. And after today, I think you will too. Here's how we're going to do this. I want to start at the worst end of the shelf, explain the biology clearly, then walk you through the best options one by one, and close with the simplest possible practical move you can make this week. Nothing complicated, nothing expensive. Let's go. The worst offender is soft, fluffy, refined white bread. The kind that squishes completely flat when you press it and practically dissolves on your tongue before you've even chewed it. Now, why does the research keep circling back to this one? It comes down to something called glycemic load, and that is just a measured way of asking, how fast and how high does this food push your blood sugar? Refined white bread has had the bran and the germs stripped away during processing. Those are the fibrous, nutrient-dense outer layers of the grain. What's left after they're removed is essentially fast starch. Your digestive system turns it into glucose almost as rapidly as straight sugar, so your blood sugar climbs quickly. And to manage that spike, your body pumps out a hormone called insulin. Now here's where the cancer thread enters the picture. And I want to be careful here because this is the exact spot where people either dismiss the concern entirely or overcorrect into panic. Neither of those is the right response. Insulin and a close cousin of it called IGF-1, that stands for insulin-like growth factor 1, and growth factor is literally what it sounds like, a molecular signal telling cells to grow and divide. These are proliferative signals. In large, well-designed observational studies, people who chronically run higher levels of circulating insulin and IGF-1 over the long term tend to show higher rates of several hormone-sensitive and metabolic cancers. Let me say that more carefully, because I don't want you walking away with the wrong idea. This is an association observed in populations, not a proven individual cause and effect. Nobody has demonstrated that eating a particular slice of white bread grows a tumor. What the research suggests is a pattern across years. A diet that keeps insulin elevated and spiking frequently may create a slightly more permissive internal environment for cell growth than a diet that keeps blood sugar steady and low. That is the honest version. I won't tell you more than that because the evidence doesn't give me more than that. There's a second study I keep coming back to when I think about this. It's called Nutrinet Santé, a large French cohort study published in the BMJ in 2018. The researchers followed around 100,000 people over several years and tracked their eating patterns carefully. What they found was that people whose diets were highest in ultra-processed foods, and soft, refined, additive-loaded supermarket bread sits squarely in that category, had a modestly but significantly higher overall cancer risk. For every 10% more of the total diet that came from ultra-processed food, they observed approximately a 12% higher cancer risk. I need to flag the obvious limitation here, because I think you deserve to hear it plainly. That is an observational study, which means it tracks associations, not causes. It cannot tell you that the bread specifically did it, because people who eat a lot of ultra-processed bread also tend to eat a lot of other ultra-processed things. And those other things matter too. But when you have a large, careful population study pointing the same direction as the underlying biological mechanism, I sit up a little. When the population data and the biology agree, that convergence is worth paying attention to. So on the plate, here's the practical takeaway from the worst end of the shelf. The bread to be thoughtful about is the soft, white, squishy loaf. And sitting right beside it in terms of concern is the sneaky cousin that's tripped up more people than almost anything else in this space. It's the loaf that just says wheat on the front, prominently, in an earthy brown font, maybe with a little wheat stalk graphic. Here's the thing, that word means almost nothing. All bread is made from wheat. If you flip that loaf over, and the first ingredient reads enriched wheat flour or unbleached wheat flour, you are holding refined flour dressed up in outdoor clothing. Same goes for the caramel-colored brown bread that is really just white bread with a tan. You are not looking for the word wheat. You are looking for the word whole. Hold on to that, because it is quite literally the whole game here. Now that's one. Let me build on that, because the next thing I want to talk about is one that almost nobody in this conversation brings up, and it's been sitting in your kitchen the whole time. It's your toaster. Or more precisely, it's how dark you let your toast get. Here's the science, and I'll keep it tight, because this doesn't need to be complicated. When you take a starchy food like bread and apply dry heat to brown it, toasting, baking, roasting, you initiate something called the Maillard reaction. That's the same beautiful chemistry that makes toast smell the way it does and turns the surface golden. But when that browning goes past golden into dark brown and all the way toward burnt, it also generates a compound called acrylamide. And acrylamide is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the cancer research arm of the World Health Organization, as Group 2A, meaning probably carcinogenic to humans. Now I want to slow you right down before you throw out your toaster, because that phrase sounds alarming, and I'm not going to let you leave with the alarm without the context. Probably carcinogenic in the IARC system is based primarily on strong evidence in animal studies and, to be honest with you, limited and still genuinely uncertain evidence in humans. This classification has been on the books since 1994. Nobody has proven that dark toast causes cancer in people. What the evidence gives us is a compound that reliably causes cancer in laboratory animals at high doses, that forms more abundantly the darker and more scorched your starchy food gets, and a reasonable, cautious basis for not eating a lot of heavily blackened, burnt food day after day for 30 years. That is the entire claim. It is not toast causes cancer. It is, don't make a habit of burning it, and the practical fix here costs you absolutely nothing. It is the cheapest thing in this entire video. Turn your toaster down one setting. Aim for golden, not dark brown. If a slice comes out black or heavily charred, scrape it or toss it. Same principle applies when you're baking or roasting anything: starchy potatoes, root vegetables, bread in the oven. Pull it at golden brown. You lose nothing. You spend nothing. You just quietly reduce your exposure to a compound the research suggests you'd be better off with less of over a lifetime. I'll tell you what I actually did in my own kitchen. I changed my toaster setting years ago and never changed it back. It was the easiest adjustment I've ever made, and I don't miss dark toast at all. I know what some of you are thinking right now, and I want to name it out loud because I think it's a fair reaction. Dr. Becker, this is just more food, fear. Everything gives you cancer these days. Coffee, toast, red meat, the air outside. I can't keep track anymore. And honestly, that is a fair thing to feel. I'm not dismissing it. So let me be the person in the room who slows down instead of speeding up the alarm. I am not telling you that toast is dangerous. I am telling you that heavily burnt toast, eaten consistently over many years, is a pattern worth quietly trimming from your routine. Golden toast is fine. Bread is fine. This is about the extreme end of the spectrum, and about what consistency over decades quietly contributes to your internal environment. If your reaction to any video on this channel is ever, well, now I can't eat anything, then I've failed you. That is never the goal here. Alright, stay with me, because now we get to the part I actually like best, the good end of the shelf. And I'll tell you, the evidence here is stronger and more encouraging than the scary side of this conversation. And that's not me trying to leave you on a happy note, that's just genuinely what the research shows. The best bread you can reach for is genuine, 100% whole grain bread. And the reason comes down to that one word we've already flagged twice: fiber. When a bread is truly whole grain, it retains the bran and the germ, those fibrous, mineral-rich outer layers that refined processing discards. That fiber does two important things inside your body. First, it slows the whole digestive process down. It physically blunts the blood sugar spike we talked about earlier, so instead of that sharp insulin surge, you get a slow, gentle, gradual rise. Steady, not spiky. That alone is a meaningful difference over years. But the second thing is the part I find genuinely fascinating, and it's my favorite mechanism in this whole topic. That fiber doesn't just pass through you passively. When it reaches your colon, the community of beneficial bacteria that live there, your gut microbiome, ferments it. And as they ferment it, they produce a short-chain fatty acid called butyrate. A short-chain fatty acid is simply a small fat molecule your gut bacteria manufacture as a byproduct of that fermentation process. And butyrate is, specifically and preferentially, the fuel source for the cells lining the wall of your colon. It helps keep those cells healthy, well-nourished, and behaving normally. In the research literature, butyrate production is one of the primary biological explanations for why dietary fiber appears to have a protective relationship with the colon specifically. That is not a vague correlation. That is a mechanism you can trace step by step. And how strong is the evidence at the population level? Let me be precise here, because I think you deserve precision rather than enthusiasm. The World Cancer Research Fund and the American Institute for Cancer Research, which are the major independent expert bodies that systematically grade this evidence, looked at all the available studies together and classified foods containing dietary fiber, and whole grains specifically, as probably protective against colorectal cancer. Now, I want you to hear that word probably accurately. In their grading framework, probable is a strong designation. It sits one level below convincing, which is the highest grade, and it means the evidence is substantial, consistent, and pointing clearly in one direction. They are not hedging out of caution. They are being precise. Their analysis found that roughly 90 grams of whole grains per day, which is about 3 ounces or roughly 2 to 3 slices of a genuine whole grain bread, is associated with approximately a 17% lower risk of colorectal cancer, and every additional 10 grams of dietary fiber per day is associated with roughly a 7% further reduction in that risk. Those are genuinely encouraging numbers. Whole grains, dietary fiber, and the colon. That is one of the more robust food and cancer relationships we have in the literature right now. Let me put that on the plate before we go further, because I promise you practical. At the supermarket, here is exactly what to do. Pick up the loaf, flip it over, find the ingredient list, which is always on the back or the side in smaller print. Read the very first ingredient. It should say whole wheat flour or whole grain wheat, or the specific name of a whole grain like whole rye or whole oats. If the first word in that ingredient list is whole, you're in good shape. Then glance down at the fiber content per slice. A genuinely good whole grain bread will give you 3 grams of fiber or more per slice. Most refined white breads give you under 1 gram. That's it. 2 data points. First ingredient, whole, fiber 3 grams or more. 5 seconds in the aisle, and you've sorted the entire shelf. Everything else on the front of the bag, the pictures, the claims, the colors, the slogans, is marketing. The truth is in the small print on the back. Now, let me give you 2 more that belong on the best end of the shelf, because I don't want you locked into one option, and there are genuinely good choices here that suit different tastes and budgets. Real dark rye bread is a wonderful one. Rye is naturally high in a particular type of soluble fiber that makes it especially effective at slowing blood sugar, and research measuring glucose responses after eating has consistently shown that rye tends to produce an even flatter, gentler blood sugar curve than whole wheat. A dense, seeded dark rye is one of the most filling and metabolically steady breads you can eat. It tends to keep you satisfied longer, which matters. Just read the bag the same way. Whole rye or whole grain rye as the first ingredient. Watch out for rye flavor listed on a loaf where the first ingredient is enriched white flour. That's rye in name only. And then there's the one I think most people have exactly backwards, and it surprises people when I explain it. Genuine sourdough. Here's what caught my attention when I first read into it. Real sourdough, made the traditional way with a live starter and a long, slow fermentation of 12 to 48 hours, actually measurably lowers the glycemic response of the bread, even in some cases when it's made partly with white flour. Let me say that carefully so I don't mislead you, because precision matters here. A real sourdough made with white flour is still not as good as a whole grain loaf for fiber content. That's an important distinction. But the long fermentation, in which wild yeast and bacteria work on the dough over many hours, produces lactic and acetic acids. Those are exactly the tart, complex flavors you taste in genuine sourdough, and those acids genuinely slow down how quickly your digestive enzymes break the starch into glucose. Human studies measuring postprandial blood sugar found that real, traditionally fermented sourdough produced a significantly lower, flatter blood sugar rise than ordinary bread made from the same flour. That is a meaningful difference, and it comes entirely from the fermentation process. Wait, let me back up and add the catch here, because it's critical. The vast majority of bread labeled sourdough in a supermarket plastic bag is not genuine sourdough. It is regular fast bread with sourdough flavoring added. No real fermentation, no live culture, none of the biological benefit. The way to spot real sourdough is this. It is heavy for its size. It has a thick, chewy crust, a genuinely sour tang when you eat it, and it almost certainly comes from a bakery or the bakery section rather than a plastic-wrapped bag on the main bread aisle. If you find a genuine whole-grain sourdough from a real baker, one with whole wheat or whole rye as the first ingredient, and actual fermentation time behind it, that is honestly as close to the best of everything as bread gets. It combines the fiber benefit of whole grain with the blood sugar blunting effect of real fermentation. That's a strong combination. One more for the best end, because I told you I wanted to give you options. Sprouted grain bread. You'll usually find it in the freezer section, sold frozen, because it has fewer preservatives than shelf-stable bread. It's made from whole grains that have been allowed to just begin germinating, to sprout, before they're milled and baked. That sprouting process makes certain nutrients somewhat more bioavailable and tends to produce a gentler blood sugar response. And because it is fundamentally built on whole grains, you still get that fiber and that butyrate story in the colon. I'll tell you what I'd actually put in my own freezer and rotate through. Some weeks it's a dense whole grain loaf from the supermarket. Some weeks it's a seeded dark rye. When I can find a genuine whole grain sourdough from a good bakery, I'll pick that up. And I keep a sprouted grain loaf in the freezer as a reliable backup because it toasts beautifully straight from frozen. I'm not precious about which specific one. The point is that every option at the good end of the shelf shares the same underlying biology: whole grains, real fiber, a gentle blood sugar curve. And any of them is meaningfully different from the squishy white loaf. Pick the one that you will actually eat and enjoy consistently. That's the one to buy. Now let me anticipate a practical objection, because I hear this one all the time and I think it deserves a real answer. Dr. Becker, genuine whole grain bread, real dark rye, actual sourdough from a bakery. These all cost more than the cheap white loaf. Is this something only people with money can do? And I hear that. I genuinely do. And I don't want this channel to be a channel where the advice is only accessible to people who already shop at the expensive end of the store. So here is the honest, affordable answer. You do not need the fanciest artisan loaf with the beautiful linen wrapping and the $12 price tag. A plain store brand 100% whole wheat bread, the simple one. First ingredient, whole wheat flour, 3 or more grams of fiber per slice, is often $1 or $2, and it accomplishes almost everything the expensive loaf accomplishes. The protective biology here is in the whole grain and the fiber, not in the artisan craftsmanship or the premium brand. The plainest loaf that passes the 2 tests, whole first, fiber 3 grams or more, does the job. And here is a small sensory clue to trust while you're standing in the aisle. A real whole grain loaf is noticeably heavier in your hand and denser when you press it. The one that springs back instantly like a foam pillow is the one to leave on the shelf. Your hand can nearly tell you before your eyes even read the ingredient list. There's a woman I think about when this topic comes up, I'll call her Margaret, who wrote to me after her husband received a colorectal cancer diagnosis. She was trying to do everything she could to help him and to protect herself, and she'd done what a lot of scared, well-meaning people do in that situation. She'd gone online, gotten completely overwhelmed, and decided they both had to give up bread entirely, cold. Like it was poison. No more toast, no more sandwiches, no bread of any kind. And she was miserable about it and wasn't sure she could keep it up. I told her what I'm telling you now. You don't need to fear bread and banish it from your house. What you need to do is be a little choosy about which bread and how dark you let it toast. She didn't need to white-knuckle her way through 0 carbs and feel deprived every morning. She needed to move from the enriched wheat flour loaf to a dense whole grain or a real rye, set the toaster to golden, and stop panicking. Last, she wrote to me, she'd found a seeded rye she genuinely liked better than the old white bread. Her husband was eating it too, and she'd stopped feeling like every meal was a crisis. That's the whole point of this channel. Not fear. A better default. Here's where I have to slow you down though, because I've been making a case, and I don't want you to walk away with an inflated version of it. None of this. Not the whole rye, not the genuine sourdough, not the sprouted grain, not the butyrate story. None of it is a cure, and none of it prevents cancer on its own. Let me say that as plainly as I can. A food does not kill cancer in your body the way a headline says it does. Bread is not going to give you cancer by itself, and bread is not going to protect you from it by itself. What we are really talking about when we talk about any of this is the pattern of your overall diet, repeated over years and decades, gently tilting your internal environment in one direction or another. A slice of white bread at a birthday party is nothing. A daily diet built on refined, ultra-processed foods day after day for 20 years is a pattern. A daily diet built on whole grains and fiber is a different pattern. I'm not asking you to fear a sandwich. I'm asking you to nudge your default, quietly and consistently, in the direction the evidence keeps pointing. And anyone who tells you a specific bread will cure cancer or prevent it with certainty is selling you something the evidence does not support. This shifts the odds a little over years. That is the honest version, and it is the only version I will give you here. One more honest thing I want to say about reading the bag, because the marketing on bread packaging is genuinely and deliberately designed to confuse a tired shopper. I don't say that to make you cynical about everything. I say it so you don't get played. Multigrain does not mean whole grain. It simply means several grains were used, and they can all be refined. Made with whole grains can legally mean a token amount of whole grain in an otherwise refined loaf. Stone ground, 7-grain, hardy, natural, ancient grains, farmhouse. None of those words are regulated in a way that guarantees the bread is nutritionally what you might assume. The one word that must appear near the front of the ingredient list to actually matter is whole. Everything else on the front panel of that bag is a picture, a graphic design choice, and a marketing promise. Flip it over. The truth is always on the back, in the small print, in the first ingredient. Once you develop the habit of going straight to the ingredient list and ignoring the front entirely, no bread company can fool you again. That knowledge is free and it works forever. And here's a question I want to address head on, because it's one I get from people in this community who are managing cancer right now or who've just finished treatment. Dr. Becker, does any of this really matter if I'm already dealing with a diagnosis? And what I'll say is this: the fiber and whole grain evidence applies across the board. It doesn't vanish if you've already had cancer. And actually, the colorectal cancer recurrence research on diet and fiber is an area of genuine and growing scientific interest. But here is the critical piece. If you are in active treatment or recovery, your nutritional needs may be different from the general population picture I've been describing. Chemotherapy and radiation can affect your digestion, your appetite, and what your body can handle. Please bring any food changes you're considering to your oncologist and your dietitian. Not as a checkbox, but because they need to know. Whole grains are generally a sound direction, but your specific situation might have specific considerations I cannot speak to. That's not a hedge. That's just true. So here's your one thing this week. It is small, it is cheap, and it takes about 30 seconds on your next shopping trip. Pick up your usual bread loaf, turn it over, and read the first ingredient. Just the first one. If it does not begin with the word whole, put that loaf back on the shelf and reach for one that does. Then when you get home, dial your toaster down one notch. Aim for golden brown every time. That is the whole assignment. 2 small adjustments. Whole as the first ingredient, and golden instead of dark. You don't need to overhaul your kitchen. You don't need to give up bread. You don't need to spend more money than you already do. You just need to make your daily default a little more aligned with what the biology suggests, and then let that better default run quietly in the background for the next 10, 15, 20 years. That is genuinely how this works. Not dramatic intervention. Consistent, boring daily choices that compound in one direction. You hold one lever every single day, sometimes 3 times a day, right there at your own table, your plate. And bread is one of the most ordinary everyday parts of that plate for most of us in this community. That's not nothing. It's not everything, and don't let anyone tell you it is. But it's a real lever. It's yours to use, and it costs you almost nothing to use it better. The whole grain swap, the toaster dial turned down one notch. That's it. That's the whole practical ask. And if you're navigating something serious right now, if you or someone you love is in treatment or watching numbers and worrying, I want you to hear this clearly. Keep your team close. Bring this kind of information to your oncologist and your registered dietitian as conversation starters, not as independent protocols you run on your own. They are your allies in this. You use the food lever, and you let them do everything else that is theirs to do. Food isn't a cure, but it is the one lever you hold 3 times a day, and that is worth something real. Keep it simple. Keep it on your plate, and I'll see you right back here. Bring a friend who needs this, and tell me in the comments what bread is already in your kitchen. Flip it over right now if you want. Read me that first ingredient, and let's see how you did. I read every single one of these, and I love hearing from you.